Today we're going to start a mini-series where we walk through one of the most famous judges in the Bible. This judge has inspired many men and women of God to stand up for God, to take a leap of faith, or to work through a season where they are struggling to trust in God. He is the golden boy of the judges. He's most people's favorite judge. Today we're talking about Gideon. However, this story of the timid wheat farmer turned valiant warrior has a darker side which not many people know about. I believe that Gideon's story is a commentary on the tendency of people to exalt leaders and influencers into the position of a king or a god. This story is about just how easily it is, despite the best attempts and purest motives of leaders to get rid of idolatry, to become the very idols that they seek to destroy. The story of Gideon, as we will see, is more about idolatry than it is about faith, though I don't think we should let that deter us from being invigorated by the power that this story has for the timid and weak in faith. Today, we are going to walk through the rise of Gideon, or as I like to call him, the axe of Ophrah. At the heart of this judge's origin story is what seems to be a field manual on how to discern God's will when your faith is tested. Today, we're going to be talking about faith and fleeces. Here we go. Okay, I would like to start out this podcast by giving my thesis statement from the story of Gideon. If you remember back to middle school or high school, your teacher may have made you write a thesis statement when you started a paper. A thesis statement is a short statement, usually one or two sentences that summarizes the main point or claim of an essay or research paper. At the time, I hated thesis statements and research papers, but now I actually find them helpful to summarize what I'm about to talk about. So this is my thesis statement for Gideon's story. I believe that Gideon's story is actually not primarily about faith, but rather about idolatry and what you do with power and influence. Now, this may seem outright wrong to many people. After all, this is Gideon we're talking about. He's probably the first character from the Bible that comes to mind when most people hear the word faith, right? Worry not. We are going to talk about Gideon's faith and the signs that he asks God to perform for most of this podcast. However, the next two podcasts are going to be about what Gideon and his son will do with all the fame and the power that was won through his faith. That's because a bulk of the text about Gideon is actually not about his battle with the Midianites and his famous requests for some signs from God, but rather most of Gideon's story is about what happens after the battle with the Midianites and what Gideon's son Avimelech does after Gideon's death. Okay, so with that being said, we're actually going to be talking about faith and asking for signs today, because obviously that's the famous part of Gideon's story, and that's what comprises the bulk of his origin stories. So let's jump into Gideon's origin story. I like to call him the axe of Ophrah. So I want to start this podcast giving some facts about Gideon. First, Gideon is from the tribe of Manasseh. Manasseh was like the state of Virginia in that it was split into two regions. Manasseh east of the Jordan and Manasseh west of the Jordan. So it was like East Manasseh and West Manasseh, like Virginia and West Virginia. Gideon was probably from West Manasseh. This part of the tribe was located in the Promised Land. So East Manasseh was across the Jordan River, not technically in the Promised Land. Okay, some more facts about Gideon. Did you know that Gideon was most likely an adult when he was called by God? I say this because most likely he has a wife or a concubine, and he was probably in his 30s when he was initially called. I say this because he has a child that shows up at the end of one of his battles with Midian, who seems to be traveling around with his army. So Gideon is also probably fairly well off. I say this because he has 10 slaves who help him cut down his family Asherah pole. Slaves at this time were not cheap. You may have noticed in the intro I called Gideon the axe of Ophrah. That's because his name, Gideon, means something like to hack, to hew, or to cut down. I should note here that Gideon's name does not point to his battle with Midian or any of the signs that he asks for. Instead, the thing that Gideon's name seems to refer to is the time when he cut down his father's Asherah pole. As a side note here, I thought about giving Gideon a nickname like the slack hanging, it was the hash slinging slasher from SpongeBob, but I thought that might be a bit corny, and SpongeBob already took it, so I opted to nickname him the Axe of Ophrah. Now, in all seriousness, Gideon has an actual nickname that he's given in the Bible and these stories, which is probably better than what I like to call him. That nickname is Jerubbaal or Yerubbaal. Yerubbaal means let Baal contend. Gideon is given this nickname because, again, when he cuts down his father's Asherah pole, he also tears down an altar to the Canaanite god Baal. And when he does this, his father keeps the whole town from killing Gideon. He tells the townspeople, will you contend for Baal? And if he, that is Baal, is a god, let him contend for himself. So again, both of Gideon's names, his real name and the nickname, surround the cutting and tearing down of his family's idols, not the defeat of Midian or the 3 times he asks for signs from God. This should, in my opinion, be very telling to us about what Gideon's story is about. If you couldn't tell already from listening to this podcast so far from the previous episodes, names in the Bible are really important. Oftentimes, they're very symbolic. Both of Gideon's name, his actual name, and his nickname point not to his faith in God or how he asks for signs or 300 men. Rather, they point to the cutting down of idols. This should be a flag for most of us as to what Gideon's character is going to be about. One more tangent before we get into Gideon's story. Something else that is very symbolic and kind of important and really prevalent throughout Gideon's story are the numbers 3 and 2. Numerology in the Bible, or the study of numbers, can be really important to understand many stories in the Bible. Just think about what comes to mind when you think of the number 3. Jesus rose on the 3rd day. Or 6, probably Satan, the devil, mark of the beast, right? 10, alternatively, brings to mind the 10 commandments, the 10 plagues. So numbers in Gideon's story will be very prevalent and pretty important. Gideon's story will go from a curious amount of sets of 3 to a lot of pairs of 2. Here, I would like to lay a bit of groundwork involving the symbolism of the numbers 3 and 2 before we jump into Gideon's story. This will help us for the next 2 podcasts as well, because I believe the numbers 3 and 2 are very symbolic and representative of the message and their respective parts of the story. Okay, so let's start by fleshing out what the numbers 3 and 2 symbolize in the Bible so that we can apply them to the story. Here are a few instances where the number 3 comes up in the Bible. So, Adam and Eve have 3 children, Cain, Abel, and Seth. Noah also has 3 children, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Jonah has to spend 3 days in the belly of a fish before being saved and spewed out. The Israelites ask Pharaoh to spend 3 days in the wilderness to worship Yahweh, and that act of asking Pharaoh to worship their God is like a test for Pharaoh. When they do go to the desert, the Israelites almost immediately spend 3 days without water before they unfaithfully test God and are given water from a rock by God. After Israel leaves Mount Sinai, 3 days' journey, they start to complain. Samson gives a parable to his in-laws that stumps them for 3 days. The Israelites have 3 sacred festivals that require them to go to Jerusalem: Passover, Pentecost, the Festival of Tabernacles. In the New Testament, Jesus was famously tempted 3 times by Satan in the desert, and he famously also rose from the dead on the 3rd day. That was a lot of 3s. So what does the number 3 mean in the Bible? Well, first, I believe the number 3 represents the inheriting of promises, salvation, and completeness. If you noticed, it was usually the 3rd generation and the 3rd child that brings salvation. Abraham and Isaac were faithful. They had their kids, right? But Jacob had 12 kids. He's the one that started the nation, and he's the one whom the nation of Israel was named after. Additionally, Adam and Eve have Cain and Abel, both of whom do not carry on their line, but rather it is through the line of their third child, Seth, that the nation of Israel also comes. Deliverance is brought about also on the third day. Most famously, Jonah spends 3 days in the belly of a fish before being delivered out of the fish in the depths of the waters. And Jesus rises again on the third day. That's the most famous one. So that's salvation, but 3 can also be a number of testing, right? Israel goes 3 days without water and then famously tests God by asking for a sign from him in a place that is called Merivah, and Merivah means testing, right? Jesus is also tested 3 times by Satan in the wilderness. Very poignantly, Samson gives his in-laws a riddle that stumps them for 3 days. But then at the end of the third day, they pass the test of the riddle by threatening to burn down the house of his new wife and her dad. So 3 in the story of Gideon will symbolize both Israel's salvation and also the tests Gideon will be given by God, and the tests Gideon will give God in order to obtain that salvation. Okay, so where does the number 3 pop up in Gideon's story? First, there isn't just one oppressor who torments Israel. Most people think it's a story about Gideon versus Midian. Kind of rhymes. It's easy to remember, right? But there are actually 3 oppressors and 3 groups of nations that Gideon attacks: Midian, Amalek, and the sons of the east. These 3 oppressors are said to take 3 types of farm animals from Israel: sheep, oxen, and donkeys. Israel would hide in 3 kinds of places: dugouts, caves, and strongholds. Gideon brings with him 3 tribes to attack his his oppressors: Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. Probably saying that wrong. God then whittles Gideon's men down to 300. And Gideon also divides this group of 300 men into 3 groups of 100. All those men have 3 things in their hands: a ram's horn, a clay pot, and a torch. Importantly for our discussion today, there are 3 signs given to Gideon by God, and correspondingly 3 commands given by God to Gideon. Kind of cool, right? Gideon will have contention or trouble with his fellow Israelites 3 times. That's right. During this battle, during this warfare, he will have internal conflict and quarreling with his own people 3 times. 2 of those times, he will take revenge on his people, on his fellow Israelites. Lastly, Gideon, while he has 70 sons, only 3 of them are named. A lot of sons, but we're only given the names of 3 of them. The 3rd son who is named will give an important speech of blessings and curses. Whew, that was a lot. That was 3. What about 2? Let's start with Adam. He's the first human, but is split in half and becomes 2 people. So he's 1 person and becomes 2. Those 2 people, Adam and Eve, then become 1 in marriage. Abraham and Isaac have 2 sons, both of whom will bring familial quarreling. Abraham has Isaac and Ishmael, and while Isaac also has 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. In both of these cases, and throughout the Bible, the second-born, not the firstborn, gets the inheritance. Almost every single time there's an issue of inheritance, it is usually the second-born that receives the inheritance and the blessings from God, and that second-born receiving the inheritance will cause some kind of quarreling or sin or jealousy and disunity within the family. Additionally, 2 siblings throughout Genesis are usually found fighting each other. Cain versus Abel. I already mentioned Ishmael and Isaac, and Jacob and Esau. Jacob also has 2 wives, and these 2 wives are sisters, Rachel and Leah. These 2 sisters will fight and quarrel constantly during his life. Additionally, Jacob steals the birthright from his brother Esau twice. Then when Jacob flees from Esau, he ends up serving his uncle Laban for 20 years, 2 sets of 10 years, and will end up bickering and quarreling with this family member too. When Jacob returns to the promised land with his 2 wives, he divides his family into 2 camps before meeting his estranged brother Esau. And in fact, before Jacob meets Esau, he names the place where he is at Machanaim, which means 2 camps. Some more instances of 2 in the Bible. You need a testimony of 2 people to convict someone of a crime. Noah takes 2 of each animal into the ark. 2 angels are sent to Sodom and Gomorrah, but 3 men appear to Abraham. Lot has 2 daughters that he offers in place of the 2 angels to the men of Sodom and Gomorrah. That was a lot of 2. It was a lot too. No pun intended. So 2 in the Bible represents both family and unity, but it also represents sin, strife, quarreling, and dissension. In the garden, it is not good for Adam to be alone, and the one must become 2 in order for things to become good. Here, the theme of marriage, where 2 become 1, symbolizes unity and family, right? However, after the garden, after that symbolism of unity, there is another set of 2, Cain and Abel, and Cain kills Abel, right? Esau wants to kill Jacob. Rachel and Leah quarrel, as do Sarah and Hagar. Oh, I also forgot to mention them. They are the 2 primary wives of Abraham. The list goes on. Sibling rivalry and rival wives are usually in pairs of 2, and those pairs of 2 often symbolize quarreling and strife within a family. Gideon, in the second part of this story, where there are many pairs of 2, will quarrel and contend with his own family and countrymen numerous times. So where do these pairs of 2 pop up in Gideon's story? Okay. After his victory over Israel's oppressors, Gideon will pursue 2 generals, one named Wolf and the other Raven. Then after them, he will pursue 2 kings, one named Zevah and the other Zalmunna. Gideon will punish 2 Israelite towns, Sukkoth and Penuel, for not helping him during his pursuit of his enemies. These are 2 towns that Jacob founded. And when Jacob founded these 2 towns, 2 is a prominent number in those stories as well. Gideon will try to get 2 children to do his bidding. First, he captures a child and forces him to write down the names of the elders of Sukkoth that he's angry with so he can punish them. Then Gideon wants to track down these elders because, they didn't help him when he was in need. And then he also tries to get his own son, Yether, probably saying that wrong, to kill the 2 kings, Zevah and Zalmunna, that he captured. As you can see, it's not very noble moves on Gideon's part. Also not really talked about much in Gideon's story. These are motives that display Gideon's disunity with his fellow Israelites and his family. Lastly, the 3 armies that I mentioned earlier become 2. After Gideon's initial victory, only the sons of the east and those 2 Midianite kings are said to remain when Gideon pursues the survivors of the battle. Very ironic then that Gideon pursues both the sons of the east. We'll talk about them more. They're going to represent exile. I'll mention why. And the 2 kings, Zevah and Zalmunna, who I think represent glory and prestige, and we'll also talk about them later. It is like Gideon will exile himself in the pursuit of his own glory. And again, more on that later. Like I said earlier, my point here is that Gideon's story will go from sets of 3s to pairs of 2, mirroring how Gideon and Israel will go from salvation by testing to familial quarreling and fighting. Gideon goes from testing God and passing God's tests, from saving Israel by faith, to fighting the very people he just fought to save. Today we're going to focus on Gideon's origin story and the 3 tests that Gideon gives God and which God conversely gives to Gideon. With all that being said, that was a lot. We're finally going to jump into Gideon's origin story. Okay, Judges chapter 6, verse 1. Then the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and Yahweh handed them over to Midian for 7 years. The hand of Midian prevailed against Israel. Because of Midian, the sons of Israel made for themselves the dens which were in mountains, and the caves and the strongholds. For whenever Israel had sown, the Midianites would come up with the Amalekites and the sons of the east and march against them. So they would camp against them and destroy the produce of the land as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance in Israel, nor sheep or ox or a donkey. For they would come up with their livestock and their tents. They would come in like locusts in number, and both they and their camels were innumerable, and they came into the land to ruin it. So Israel was brought very low because of Midian, and the sons of Israel cried out to Yahweh. Now it came about, when the sons of Israel cried out to Yahweh on account of Midian, that Yahweh sent a prophet man to the sons of Israel. And he said to them, "This is what Yahweh, the God of Israel, says. It was I who brought you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of slavery. And I rescued you from the hands of the Egyptians, from the hands of all your oppressors. And I drove them out from you and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am Yahweh your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you live. But you have not listened to my voice." Okay, let's stop there. First, I'd like to take a bit of time to talk about the 3 bad guys in this story: Midian, Amalek, and the sons of the east. Let's start with Midian. This nation comes from a guy who is named Midian as well. Midian was one of Abraham's sons by one of his side wives, Keturah. Midian means strife in Hebrew. You may have heard of this people group before. That's because back in Exodus, Moses' wife, Zipporah, is also a Midianite. I think this is really interesting then, because even though Zipporah had a father who was a priest of God Most High, she seemed to be allies with Israel and with Moses back in Exodus. And now the Midianites are opposing Israel. I think Midian is supposed to be like a close relative and an ally with Israel, which makes the Midianites' aggression against Israel a bit of a family affair. Next, there is the Amalekites. These guys come from someone named Amalek, very fitting, who is the grandson of Esau. Amalek means something like valley dweller. Their tribe occupied the land just south of Israel. These guys are most famous for attacking Israel in Exodus 17. This is the story where Moses lifts his hands and Israel starts winning, and then when he lowers his hands, they start losing. After this battle, this is what Yahweh tells Moses to write down about Amalek: "I will utterly wipe out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." So Moses goes on to say that Yahweh will have war against Amalek from generation to generation. So while Midian is like a family friend that has turned on Israel, the Amalekites are like a perpetual enemy who consistently stands in the way of inheriting God's promise. These guys are like the Fire Nation from Avatar: The Last Airbender, which, by the way, is the greatest show to ever air on television, or like the First Order from Star Wars. These guys are like the token bad guys of the Bible. That's the Amalekites. Lastly, there's the sons of the east. This is a bit of a stranger one, right? For sure, the sons of the east were not an actual nation in the Bible. These guys seem to be tapping into the direction east and its symbolism in the Bible. And east is almost always associated with exile and moving away from God. So, why is that the case? The Garden of Eden was actually a garden in the land called Eden, and when it is introduced in Genesis 2, it is said to be in the east of Eden, right? So the garden in Eden is said to be in the east of Eden. Then Adam and Eve, when they're exiled, when they eat the forbidden fruit and they're exiled away from the garden, they are said to be driven further east away from the garden. Cain, too, when he is exiled from the land of Eden, goes to a land called Nod, or wandering, and Nod is a land said to be east of the land of Eden. So Adam and Eve are driven east out of the garden in Eden. They're still in Eden. And then Cain is driven away from the land of Eden. And both of those times, they're driven in the direction east. The people who build a tower in Babel, who build the Tower of Babel, build it on a plain in the east. When Lot and Abraham separate, Lot goes east as well to a place that is well watered like the Garden of Eden. That place happens to be Sodom and Gomorrah, which was not a good place. Abraham sends the sons of his concubines, including Midian, to the land of the east. So at the end of Abraham's life, he sends away a lot of his the sons of his concubines, so he can just have Isaac, and he sends a lot of them, including Midian, to the land of the east. When Jacob has to flee from his brother Esau, he's also said to live in the land of the east. A lot of east, right? So the eastern land, or the eastern peoples, are clearly a reference to exile in the Bible, to exiled peoples. In the story of Gideon, Israel is not sent eastward like Adam and Eve, or Jacob, or Cain, or any of those other characters who go east when they're going to exile. The eastern dwelling peoples come in to plunder Israel. It is then like the proverbial direction of exile, east comes into Israel instead of Israel going east into exile. Whew, that was a lot. Let's put this all together. The Midianites, Amalek, and the sons of the east all plunder Israel. This conglomeration of nations seems to be a combination of people groups who represent exile coming down upon the Israelites. Amalek is a group that Israel finds in the wilderness wandering years, and a people that tries to keep Israel from getting into the promised land. So they're Israel meets them when they're in their proverbial exile, right? And they try to keep them in exile. Midian is a place where Moses is exiled to when he flees to Egypt, right? That's where he spends, I think, 40 years. The land of the east is directly correlated with exile in the Bible. So these nations are like a threefold exile that forms a perfect and complete plundering of Israel. Very fittingly, they do this for 7 years. We didn't talk about the number 7, but 7 is a number of completion and rest in the Bible. Notice how these threefold oppressors are more like a plague on the land than they are like foreign invaders who are attacking and oppressing people. Their threat is more to the land of Israel and less to the Israelites themselves. They don't leave any livestock. They are said to be like locusts, and they are also said to come up to the land and destroy it, right? So they take the livestock, the farm animals. They're said to be like locusts, and they destroy the land, not the people. And it's as if that were not enough. They destroy crops and farm animals as well as the land, right? I find that very fitting because it shows that exile can come into your life in very unexpected ways. Gideon will himself soon go from saving Israel to being proverbially exiled from his own people after this salvation that he brings about. He will be the one who partly brings exile upon himself via his acts of vengeance and quests for glory. So interestingly, Israel is shown here as sending themselves into exile, and then Gideon will bring them out of exile, but then will immediately go into exile himself. So it's this perpetual cycle of regaining God's promises, going into exile, and then regaining God's promises and going back into exile. I'd also like to point out that after this plundering and exiling of sorts of the land of Israel, there's this strange prophet man who is sent to Israel to give them a message. But then we are not given any rebuttal by Israel or any circumstance or situation in which this message is given. Actually, this prophet man gives this message to Israel after they cry out to Yahweh because of their oppression. So this message is like God's response to Israel crying out for help. I find that a little weird. We were just given 2 sentences of this message from this unnamed prophet man to the people of God. I think what's going on here is that this prophet is giving us a window into how God feels about Israel. And the emotions sound more like that of an angry spouse or a frustrated parent to me. I should also point out here that this is a prophet man again. There's a Hebrew word to denote a male and female prophet and prophetess. But the authors have added in the word man in Hebrew here. I think this is similar to our story with Deborah, can't say her name right, who is called a prophet woman instead of a prophetess. Whereas in Deborah's story, her being a woman was to draw our attention to the theme of the seed of the serpent. The authors are now drawing our attention to this prophet being male. I should also note the message of the prophet man here is about Yahweh, how Yahweh saved Israel from Egypt and commanded them not to worship the gods of the land that they are living in. I interpreted this whole interaction as God venting to the Israelites. It is almost like the Israelites are a child that has broken a rule yet again and have hurt themselves because they broke that rule. Like, they don't touch the stove. And then they like touch the stove, right? And like God's like, hey, I told you not to touch the stove. And he's kind of frustrated with them. When they go to God, he sounds more like an angry parent that reminds them why they are in pain because they broke the rule. But here I should note that the very next verse is going to be about Yahweh sending his angel to Ophrah to raise up Israel's next savior. So while this prophet's man's words are very angry and laced with frustration, God's actions show his compassion and love for Israel. Again, let's remember that the number 3 here is both testing and salvation. And through the prophet man's message, we see that Israel has failed the test and that they have not listened to the voice of God. But we also see that God is raising up salvation and a savior to rescue his people, despite the fact that they failed the test. Really cool. Oh, that was a lot. That was Gideon's enemies, and the whole setup for our story. Now we're going to jump into Gideon's calling. Judges 6, starting in verse 11. Then the angel of Yahweh came and sat under the oak that was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite. And his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress in order to save it from the Midianites. And the angel of Yahweh appeared to him and said to him, Yahweh is with you, valiant warrior. Then Gideon said to him, O my master, if Yahweh is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles, which our fathers told us about, saying, did not Yahweh bring us up from Egypt? But now Yahweh has abandoned us and handed us over to Midian. And Yahweh turned to him and said to him, Go in the strength of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Have I not sent you? But he said to him, O master, how am I to save Israel? Behold, my family is the least in Manasseh, and I am the youngest in my father's house. Yet Yahweh said to him, I will certainly be with you, and you will strike Midian as one man. So Gideon said to him, If now I have found favor in your sight, then perform a sign for me that it is you speaking with me. Please don't depart from here until I come back to you, and bring out my offering and lay it before you. And he said to him, I will remain here until you return. So Gideon went in and prepared a young goat and unleavened bread from an ephah of flour. He put the meat in a basket and the broth in a pot, and brought them out to him under the oak, and presented them to him. And the angel of God said to him, Take the meat and the unleavened bread, and lay them on this rock, and pour out the broth. And he did so. Then the angel of Yahweh put out the end of his staff, which was in his hand, and touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and fire came up from the rock, and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread. Then the angel of Yahweh departed from his sight. When Gideon perceived that he was an angel of Yahweh, Gideon said, O my master Yahweh, I have seen the angel of Yahweh face to face. But Yahweh said to him, Peace to you, Shalom. Do not be afraid. You shall not die. Then Gideon built an altar there to Yahweh and named it Yahweh is Shalom. To this day, it is still in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Okay, first of all, did you catch the sets of 3 here? Gideon gives the angel a 3-course meal for a sacrifice: meat, bread, and broth. Secondly, I would like to point out, as many people have, that the angel of Yahweh begins his conversation with Gideon by addressing Gideon's identity before addressing Gideon's calling. This brings us to our Bible conspiracy theory of the week. Here's my Bible conspiracy theory. What if the angel of Yahweh went to Gideon, of all people, because he knew that Gideon was already toying with the idea of a rebellion? What if the angel knows that Gideon is wanting to attack the Midianites? What if he's trying to nudge Gideon along to get him to do what he wants to do, but has been too afraid to go through with? Here's my reasoning for this theory. The angel walks up to Gideon and just starts talking to him with no introduction whatsoever. It just looks like this man. Gideon doesn't know he's an angel. He just says, Yahweh is with you, mighty warrior. And Gideon's response is even more telling. Instead of asking this guy who he is or why he would possibly call him a valiant warrior, Gideon says, if Yahweh is with us, why has all this happened to us? Gideon protests and struggles with the idea that Yahweh could possibly be with them and his people if they are going through such a hard time. He focuses on the statement that Yahweh is with them and not that he's a valiant warrior. I think Gideon's response betrays what is actually on his heart, not the fear of the Midianites or his ineptitude as a warrior. Though it does seem like he feels inept, I think primarily Gideon is struggling with why it feels as though God has abandoned his people. Gideon's primary struggle isn't his identity as the least of his family, but rather it is his faith and trust in God. That kind of makes sense when you think about it, right? Okay. That was my Bible conspiracy theory of the week. As we walk through this story, we're going to see Gideon begin to come up with a plan of how to attack Midian, the Midianites and the Amalekites and the sons of the east. And it looks like God gives Gideon some of the seeds for his battle plan, but he will never tell Gideon how to actually attack the Midianites in this story. So as we go through the rest of the story, look out for the things that God leaves up to Gideon, like the things that he leaves up for how Gideon will do it, and the things that God specifically commands Gideon to do. In other words, God will at times be very specific in how Gideon is supposed to do something, like how he is supposed to whittle down his troops. And at times, God will be very vague in what he commands Gideon to do. Like here, when he simply tells Gideon to strike down the Midianites, and he doesn't tell Gideon how to do that. Okay, let's get back to the story at hand. Enough of the conspiracy theory. Just keep an eye out for that, right? I'd like to point out that both Gideon and the prophet man cite the Exodus narrative. The prophet man cites the Exodus narrative as the reason to see God's continued faithfulness toward Israel, almost like an incriminating proof as to why Israel should not have followed after other idols. Gideon, however, cites the Exodus narrative as a reason why God is not faithful toward Israel. Interesting. Gideon sees God's past faithfulness and concludes that since his life does not look like the Exodus from Egypt, God must not be faithful. It's ironic then that the angel is essentially putting the onus on Gideon to be faithful towards God before he can see God being faithful towards Israel. In other words, Gideon is pointing the finger at God and asking why he isn't saving Israel, but God is pointing the finger right back at Gideon and calling him to be Israel's savior. And it's interesting that they both get that from the Exodus narrative. One's the wrong way to look at things, right? One looks at the Exodus narrative and says, oh, that's not happening in my life. God's the problem. The other one says, oh, I must be the problem. It must be my faith that's lacking here. My takeaway from this is to be careful how you interpret history and how you see the stories of the Bible. Sometimes if your life doesn't feel like the Bible, it may not be God's fault, but rather your own sin or doubt or trust issues in the way of God's promises. Okay, so after Gideon protests that God seems to have abandoned Israel, the angel only now commands Gideon to go in his strength and attack Midian. I should note here that the angel doesn't give Gideon a plan, nor does he promise to have some men meet up with him or tell him to rally some troops. He just tells Gideon, go attack Midian, and not how to go about doing that. I think this is because the angel knows that Gideon is able to come up with a plan to figure out how to attack the Midianites and to lead Israel in war. And I believe that the angel thinks that Gideon just needs belief in himself and trust in God in order to do that. So again, I think the angel knows that Gideon may be churning up some ideas of rebellion, right? He just needs to nudge him in that direction. Now this brings us to the beginning of Gideon's 3 signs and the corresponding 3 commands that God gives Gideon. Most people know that Gideon asks for a sign of the famous fleece, where Gideon asks God to make a fleece that he lays out wet and the ground dry, and vice versa, over 2 nights. But I didn't know until studying the story that Gideon asks for 2 more signs. And it seems like every time Gideon asks God for a sign, God correspondingly commands or requires Gideon to do something with each of these signs. So this first sign that Gideon asks for is to give a sacrifice to this angel. I should admit that this is a bit strange for a sign. It seems like Gideon is asking to talk to the stranger over a meal because he doesn't think that he's an angel, right? However, before he goes and prepares his meal, he asks the angel, "Perform for me a sign that it is you speaking with me." So what is this? A sign, an offering, or like a hospitable gesture? Did Gideon expect the angel, this angel that looked like a man, to burn up this meat and this meal in a pillar of fire? Or is he just trying to sit down and have a meal with this stranger to ask him about how he should go about attacking the Midianites? I don't know, but here's my best guess. I think that we can conclude from this that Gideon is needing some sort of confirmation or sign that this stranger he's talking to really is speaking on God's behalf. Let's remember here that Gideon gives the angel 3 things in this meal, and that 3 oftentimes symbolizes tests and testing. I think this informs us that at the very least this meal could be a test from Gideon to see if the stranger he is talking to really is speaking on behalf of God. And here I think we can begin to glean some wisdom from Gideon's signs. They seem to me to be, in my opinion, asked out of a heart of Gideon's weak faith. But it also seems to me like Gideon asks for them because he is unsure if God is really the one telling him to do these things. Like, is this guy really from God? Does he really speak on God's behalf? Is he really an angel? They are, in fact, many tests which Gideon is giving to God. I should note here that Gideon's story feels a lot like Moses' calling at the burning bush. Moses also was given many signs by God when he is called, and Moses is also very unsure of himself, not sure. He's very unsure of himself and his ability to liberate God's people. In fact, in Moses' story, Moses is given signs, and those signs seem to be gracious concessions from God. But when the Israelites ask God for a sign, their requests are painted as a sin and as them collectively sinfully testing God. Similarly here, Gideon asking God for a sign, while it may be implied to be Gideon testing God, it does not, in my opinion, seem to be viewed entirely negative by the authors. At the very least, it seems like neutral, neither sinful nor righteous. But I will say that Gideon only asks God for those signs when God has commanded or is about to command Gideon to step out in faith. So it feels like Gideon's requests for signs are a way of God meeting Gideon where he is at. And Israel's requests for signs are a way of them refusing to meet God where he is calling them to go. I think the wisdom to be gained here is that you can either ask God for signs out of a desire to be more faithful and to ultimately obey him, or you can ask for signs out of a desire to refuse to believe in God and out of a refusal to obey him. I'll only go there if God does this. And the line there is kind of fine, right? It doesn't take much to go from one side to the other. It's almost like Gideon is telling God, I want to believe in you. I just need help. Like that man who tells Jesus, I do believe, help me in my unbelief. While the Israelites in the desert were saying, we will only believe you if you meet our requirements. It's also worth noting here that while Gideon does seem to test the stranger into asking for a sign, the Israelites test God after they've already seen multiple signs from Moses and God. They should already know to trust in God's words and God's direction. In other words, Gideon asks a stranger for a sign before God has given him any confirming signs. So I do think there is merit in Gideon testing him to see if he is really from God or not. Whereas the Israelites test God after they have been given multiple really crazy miraculous signs. It's at least how I read this text. Okay, that was a lot. Let's keep going because there are still 2 more commands and 2 more signs to go. Judges chapter 6, starting in verse 25. Now on the same night, Yahweh said to him, take your father's bull, even a second bull, 7 years old, and tear down the altar of Baal, which belongs to your father, and cut down the Asherah pole that is beside it, and build an altar to Yahweh your God on the top of this stronghold in an orderly way, and take a second bull and offer a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah pole, which you shall cut down. Then Gideon took 10 men from his servants and did as Yahweh had spoken to him. And because he was too afraid of his father's household and the men of the city to do it by day, he did it by night. When the people of the city got up early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal had been torn down, and the Asherah pole which had been beside it had been cut down, and the second bull had been offered on the altar which had been built. So they said to one another, who did this thing? And when they searched and inquired, they said, Gideon the son of Joash did this thing. Then the men of the city said to Joash, bring out your son, that he may die. For he has torn down the altar of Baal, and indeed he has cut down the Asherah pole which was beside it. But Joash said to him, and said to all who stood against him, will you contend for Baal, or will you save him? Whoever will contend for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, since someone has torn down his altar. Therefore, on that day he named Gideon Yeru Baal, that is to say, let Baal contend against him, because he has torn down his altar. Then all the Midianites, the Amalekites, the sons of the east, they all assembled together, and they crossed over and camped in the valley of Jezreel. So the Spirit of Yahweh clothed Gideon like clothing, and he blew a trumpet, and the Abiezerites were called together to follow him, and he sent messengers throughout Manasseh, and they also were called together to follow him, and he sent messengers to Asher and Zebulun and Naphtali, and they came up to meet him. Okay, notice that while I said Gideon's story will go from sets of threes to pairs of two, this section has a few twos in it. Gideon is told by God to take a, quote, second bull, unquote, whatever that means, and sacrifice it on a makeshift altar to Yahweh. Additionally, Gideon tears down two things, an Asherah pole and an altar to Baal, before building his altar to Yahweh on top of it. Let's remember that two usually represents unity and division in the Bible, and this command from God creates contention and division between Gideon and his own hometown. Also notice how Gideon takes liberties to obey God in his own way here. God is, yet again, pretty vague in his commandments and what he commands Gideon to do. He does not specify if Gideon should do this by himself, nor what time of day, or how. Essentially, at all, he doesn't say how Gideon should do it. Gideon gets help via 10 extra servants, and he chooses to do this at night because he probably knew how scandalous this act would have been. This brings me to my next point. Why does Gideon have to cut down the Asherah pole and the altar to Baal before fighting Midian? This wasn't in God's original command. Originally, God simply commanded Gideon to defeat the Midianite oppressors. Why include this act, which, by the way, would have turned Gideon's, and it did turn Gideon's own tribe against him? When you think about it, this move is not the best way to start an uprising and to start raising support for men to go out and risk their lives with you in war. Gideon is taking a very unpopular and frowned upon political and religious position. I say political because Gideon is essentially infringing upon his fellow Israelites' freedom of religion. This would be akin to Gideon turning his local family pagan temple into a church overnight. Then all the pagan worshippers who would normally go there who would normally worship their gods there, like Zeus or Apollos, wherever, would wake up the next morning and see a cross where the pagan idol should be. Today, if a Christian did this, I think other Christians would actually be angry with them. That's because Gideon is essentially forcing his family and also his town to not worship the pagan gods of Baal or Asherah. And he is also limiting their worship to Yahweh alone, essentially without anyone else's consent. Now let's answer that question. Why did God command Gideon to tear down this pagan altar and set up another one to Yahweh in his place? Like, why do this before attacking the Midianites? I think it is because God is wanting Gideon to take a very public stance on whom he worshipped. I also think it was to sift out anyone in his family and hometown who is not totally committed to the worship of Yahweh. After all, Many of these men would have been the first recruits to go with him to war. Now, I think it's important to point out that it is only after Gideon cuts down the Asherah pole that the Spirit comes on him, and the Spirit comes on him like clothing, and only now, after the Spirit comes on him, does he rally some troops. I believe there's a lot of wisdom to be found there. There's a lot of wisdom there. How does one receive the Holy Spirit? A great Bible study that I would recommend to everyone would be to look up every single instance where the Spirit comes up and comes upon somebody. So anytime the Spirit is poured out upon somebody, and to ask, what did the person do to get the Spirit to be poured out upon them? You will notice very quickly that though there are some commonalities, it is all in all pretty hard to find an easy formula. I think that's because the Spirit oftentimes comes on people in many different ways. I think that's because what it looks like to trust in God looks very different for each person. What I may need to do in order to place my trust in God and receive His Spirit looks really different than what my roommate or my pastor or someone down the street at a different church may need to do. For Gideon, it seems like God knows that he needs to make a very public stand for God, to go against the grain and put some skin in the game, so to speak, before he can have the confidence to assemble an army. And did you notice it's not something that God commands Gideon to do? We should remember that God told Gideon to strike down Midian, but later that same night, God comes to Gideon again and gives him the second command to cut down this pagan shrine. It almost feels like God knows Gideon may be delaying or second-guessing himself. I imagine that he may have been on his bed or pacing his house, trying to rack his brain on how to assemble an army to defeat the Midianites. But then God comes to him in some sort of vision and tells him to focus on the spiritual. He gets him to the heart of the matter. This command, I believe, is more for Gideon and his confidence than it is for God. Lastly, I would like to point out that the Spirit is said to clothe Gideon like clothing. If that sounds redundant, it's because it also sounds redundant in Hebrew like it does in English. I find it interesting that the way to describe the Spirit in relation to Gideon here is in the metaphor of his clothing, his outward appearance. I thought the Spirit is something that we normally think of as something that works internally, but here it is primarily an external metaphor. After Gideon has publicly taken a stance for God, he's clothed externally with the Spirit like clothing. I think that some people may need to take a public declaration and statement for God before they can receive His Spirit. Some people may need to publicly put skin in the game and their reputation on the line before they can receive the Spirit. Gideon was given a derogatory nickname by his father here, but he also received the Holy Spirit. So it was almost like Gideon got a bad name with men and got a good standing with God. Which, I don't know if I would be willing to be publicly shamed in order to receive the Holy Spirit. I'll say I would, but it's like one of those moments like when push comes to shove, what are you going to do? Maybe for some people, there are very public idols that they need to take a stand against before they can receive the Holy Spirit. These are some very difficult questions, but I think we're meant to put ourselves in Gideon's shoes and ask ourselves, is God asking me to take a public stance on something? Is God asking me to cut down an idol or to do something that's going to be really socially or politically frowned upon, but that will glorify Him in the process, and it will actually help, help the people around me? Okay, so we'll keep going, and now we're getting into Gideon's second sign and God's third command. Judges 6, starting in verse 36. Then Gideon said to God, if you're going to save Israel by my hand, as you have spoken, look, I'm putting a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand. as you have spoken. And it was so. When he got up early the next morning and wrung the fleece out, he wrung the dew from the fleece, a bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to God, "Do not let your anger burn against me, so that I may speak only one more time. Please let me put you to the test only once more with the fleece. Let it be dry on the fleece, and let there be dew on all the ground." And God did so that night, for it was dry on the fleece, and the dew on the ground was all around. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him got up early and camped beside the spring of trembling. And the camp of Midian was on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. And Yahweh said to Gideon, "The people who are with you are too many for me to hand Midian over to them. Otherwise Israel would boast against me, saying, 'My own hand has saved me.' Now therefore come, proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, 'Whoever is afraid and trembling is to return and leave Mount Gilead.' So 22,000 people from the people returned, but 10,000 remained. Then Yahweh said to Gideon, 'The people are still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you. So it shall be that of he whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, he shall go with you. But of every one of whom I say to you, this one shall not go with you, he shall not go with you.' So he brought the people down to the water. Then Yahweh said to Gideon, 'You shall put everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps in one group, and everyone who kneels down to drink in another.' Now the men of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people kneeled down to drink water. And Yahweh said to Gideon, 'I will save you with 300 men, with the 300 men who lapped, and will hand the Midianites over to you, so have all the other people go, each man to his home.' So the 300 men took the people's provisions and their trumpets in their hands. And Gideon dismissed all the other men of Israel, each to his tent, but retained the 300 men, and the camp of Gideon was below him in the valley." Okay, let's start with Gideon's test and famous request for a sign through this fleece. Notice how the first sign Gideon asks for, the meal he gives to the angel, is implied to be a test. But this sign, this request for a sign, is explicitly called both a sign and a test by Gideon. Gideon even asks God, essentially, "Please don't be mad at me, but can I test you again?" It's like he knows this is not a kosher thing to ask for, and that it would probably anger God. This, I think, helps us set the context and frame why Gideon isn't punished for explicitly testing God, even though he almost everywhere else in the Bible, putting the Lord your God to the test is a sin. While Gideon isn't punished for testing God 2 times with this fleece, I should note that God turns right around and tests Gideon's men twice by whittling down his army 2 times. So it is almost like God is saying, "Okay, Gideon, you can test me, but every time you test me, I'm going to test you right back." It should also be noted that Gideon was endowed with the Holy Spirit just a few verses before this, and he almost immediately gets cold feet and begins to doubt God yet again right before the battle. Now, you may have also noticed that I have amended this translation and have actually translated what normally would be called the spring of Harod in most Bibles. Harod means trembling, if you couldn't tell. And for some reason, it has been transliterated in most Bibles, which just means the translators have spelled the Hebrew words with English letters. So it's the Hebrew word harod. The reason I've translated this word is because Gideon goes to the spring of trembling, or the spring of Harod, and then God sends away all his men who are trembling. The obvious implication of this is that this is a place where a lot of Gideon's men began to become fearful and they began to tremble. This, I think, tells us one more reason why God may have asked Gideon to whittle down his army. Of course, God does tell Gideon that he is whittling down his men so that Israel won't be able to say, "My own hand has saved me." A good practice when reading the Bible is to learn how to spot and highlight key and repeated words. I'm going to try and have a PDF for this episode, like a transcript. And in the PDF, I'll try to highlight the words trembling, test, and hand in this passage. I believe these words all give us reason as to why God whittles Gideon's army with this third and final command. So we talked about the words test and trembling. Now what about hand? Well, the first time that hand is mentioned here is when Gideon is asking God for a sign of the fleece. He tells God to make the fleece wet and the ground dry if you're going to save Israel by my hand, as you have spoken. So Gideon is concerned with God saving Israel by his own hand, but God is concerned with Israel, and maybe by implication Gideon here, knowing that it was by God's hand that they were saved. Now these weird tests that God gives Gideon's men begin to light up. First, God sends away all the men who are trembling. And earlier they were camped at the spring of trembling. Then there's this strange test where God has the men go down to the water, which, by the way, was a stream, which probably came from the spring of trembling that they were camped by. They were camped by a stream, and then they go down to they were camped by a spring, and they go down to a stream, right? And he sends away any man who does not use their hand to drink the water. Out of this test, 300 men used a hand to drink the water. And those are the 300 that go with Gideon. Lastly, Gideon puts a trumpet into the hands of these 300 men. So what is going on with the use of this word hand? I think the most plain takeaway is that God is whittling down Gideon's men so they will not think that it was by their own hand that they were saved. But ironically, God seems to choose the men who drink water like a dog by taking their hand and lapping the water out of their hand. It is like the hand is showing agency here. The men who take agency in drinking their water are given more agency by holding a trumpet later on and going to battle, right? This whole ordeal and these tests are given so that Israel will know that it is not by their own power or their own agency that they will achieve military victory. Rather, it is through God's agency and dominion that they are saved. I hope that makes sense. So, first, God sends away all the people who are trembling at the spring of trembling, but then he sends away all the people who don't take agency on by using their hands to drink water. But he does this all in the process of whittling down his men so that everyone there and all of Israel will know that it's not by their own hand or their own agency that they're saved, but it's by God's agency. Okay, now we're going to move on to the last sign of the story, and this time God is the one who voluntarily gives Gideon this sign. Judges chapter 7, starting in verse 9. Arise, go down against the camp, for I've handed it over to you. But if you are afraid to go down, go with Purah, your servant, down to the camp, so that you will hear what they say, and afterward your hand will be strengthened to go down against the camp. So he went down with Purah, his servant, to the edge of the army that was in the camp. Now the Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the sons of the east were lying in the valley, as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. When Gideon came, look, a man was relating a dream to his friend, and he said, Look, I dreamed a dream. And look, a loaf of barley bread was tumbling into the camp of Midian, and it came to the tent and struck it so that it fell and turned it upside down, so that all the tents collapsed. And his friend replied, This is nothing other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has handed over to him Midian and all the camp. When Gideon heard the account of the dream and its interpretation, he bowed and worshipped. Then he returned to the camp of Israel and said, Arise, for Yahweh has handed over to you the camp of Midian. And he divided the 300 men into 3 columns, and he put trumpets and empty pitchers into the hands of all the men, with torches inside the pitchers. Then he said to them, Look at me and do likewise. And look, when I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I and all who are with me blow the trumpet, then you also blow the trumpet around the entire camp and say, For Yahweh and for Gideon. So Gideon and the 300 and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle night watch, when they had just posted the watch, and they blew the trumpets and smashed the pitchers that were in their hands. When the 3 columns blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers, they held the torches in their left hand and the trumpets in their right hands for blowing, and shouted, "A sword for Yahweh and for Gideon." And each stood in his place around the camp. And all the camp ran out, crying as they fled. And when they blew the 300 trumpets, Yahweh set the sword of one against another, even throughout the entire camp. And the camp fled as far as the house of the acacia toward Seirah, as far as the edge of the dancing meadow by Tabat. And the men of Israel were summoned from Naphtali, Asher, and all Manasseh, and they pursued Midian. Okay, so this is the last sign, and I think it could be interpreted two different ways. First, I think you interpret the Midianites' interpretation of his friend's dream as serious and a reflection of how afraid the entire Midianite camp is of Gideon, right? So you could be like, Gideon like overhears this interpretation and his friends like, this is surely Gideon, right? It could be serious. I think you could also take this as the Midianites being a little bit sarcastic about his friend's dream, where the Midianite tells his friend, "This is nothing other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, and surely God has handed all of us over to him." Either way, I think it is a pretty obvious sign to Gideon. What are the odds that out of this whole camp and all the men that Gideon overhears, he would overhear the one guy who had a dream about him the night before, and that this guy's friend gives him such an obvious interpretation of that dream that, hey, like, Gideon's going to destroy us all. We should also not forget here that dreams, in the understanding of the biblical authors and really most of the ancient peoples, were from the gods. In other words, dreams held much more weight and authority to an ancient person than to us, who might just dismiss them as sort of like a nighttime hallucination. Also, like I said before, now God is the one who initiates the sign. He must know Gideon is still afraid. And at this point, you feel like God knows Gideon so well, he can sense when Gideon is beginning to doubt and get cold feet, and when he needs a little injection of faith. Also, as I've been saying, God never tells Gideon how to fight the Midianites. He is simply telling him what to do and leaving the how up to Gideon. But it should be noted that Gideon does have a very well thought out plan, which is to essentially pretend to be a bigger army than he really is. I also want to note here that this plan is something Gideon would not have come up with if he hadn't whittled his army down so much. So it's almost like God's commands to Gideon are both to help Gideon formulate a plan and also to prepare Gideon's heart for the battle. It is like God's giving Gideon hints through his commands, but he still leaves the how up to Gideon. I really appreciate this because you can see in this story that God's commands are usually more about the why, and that sometimes God leaves the actual plan and the how up to us. It's also curious that before this passage, Gideon put a trumpet in the hand of all of the 300 men, and so he starts to begin to formulate his plan, and then it's only after he hears about this dream that he like fulfills that plan. And he's like, all right, now get a torch and a clay pot, right? So it's like he's starting to, like, he is thinking about like having everyone blow the horns and pretending to be bigger than who they really were. But then he's like, okay, let me add the torches. Let me add the smashing of the pottery, right? Gideon's final plan, when you think about it, is actually one of the best ways for him to defeat Midian. If he tried to attack this big army head on, he would not have this advantage. But when Gideon is forced to use scare tactics, so to speak, probably because of the combination of that dream he hears about and God whittling down his army, he suddenly gains a big advantage that he otherwise would not have had. Okay. Oh, that is most of this episode, right? That's most of Gideon's origin story. Let's get into some takeaways and some closing thoughts. Sometimes I think God is more concerned with us going to battle in the right situations and not how we go to battle. I think he just cares that we show up and give it our all. I think that sometimes God wants us to come up with a plan because all he cares about is us showing up to the battle and giving him the glory. And the commands for Gideon were to prepare his heart. The mind was already prepared. It was already churning. It was already thinking up of ways to attack the Midianites. God's preparation for your battles are usually primarily spiritual and secondarily physical or or intellectual. They're to ensure he gets the glory that you are fighting for. Gideon's origin story has been a source of hope and encouragement to those struggling in their faith for such a long time. This shows us that even when we are weak in our faith, even when we try to put God to the test, he remains faithful to us. Even when we doubt God like Gideon, even whenever we put God to the test over and over and over again, God is still faithful. But it also warns us that there is a test we are going to be put through, and if Gideon could pass those tests, so can you. All right, that's all I got for y'all today. Next time, we're going to finish Gideon's story. That's right, his story does not end here. There's still a lot left to go in Gideon's story in his life. Next time, the story will go from the number 3, which represents the testing of Gideon, and God's salvation, to the number 2, which represents unity, and sadly for Gideon's story, disunity, quarreling, and a lot of pettiness within God's family. Thanks for listening, guys. I'll see y'all next time.